Hi, this is Dr. Churchill again, and this is Astronomy 308 Into the Final Frontier. We are continuing our Module 2 space race, and we're on our second lecture of Project Apollo. Today, we're going to talk about Apollo 9 through Apollo 17. I'm going to, again, do a little bit of a review on how you conduct a moon landing, just to continue to hammer that concept into people. I think it's very important to have some sense about how you actually go to the moon and come back. Now, if you remember from part one of this lectures series on the Apollo project, we covered Apollo 1 and the fire, and then we covered Apollo 7 and Apollo 8 in the last series. And the Apollo 8 was a spectacular mission. It was the first time that anybody had gone to the moon and had then gone into lunar orbit and then come home. And it marked the transition from just going up into Earth orbit and doing some engineering type of flights to actually exploring the navigation and pathway that was required to get to and from the moon. So we also talked about the reasons why Apollo 8 went to the moon right after Apollo 7. And the first reason was that the lunar landing module wasn't ready. And so without the lunar landing module being able to be incorporated into the next mission, then they postponed the mission for testing what they call the shakedown mission of the lunar landing module to Apollo 9. And decided that they needed to do something spectacular with Apollo 8. They thought that they could learn how to navigate back and forth to the moon. But also the CIA had reported to NASA that the N1 moon rocket that the Soviets were building was sitting on the launch pad in November and October of 1968, which was just around the time that the Apollo 8 mission was supposed to fly. And interestingly, the launch window for the Soviets was about 2 weeks before that of the Apollo 8 mission. And so NASA was petrified that they were actually going to launch that rocket and send an astronaut around the moon and beat them again. But in fact, the N1 did not lift off, and the Apollo 8 mission flew, and the Americans were the first ones to get out to the moon. So I'm going to share my slides with you, and we're going to go through Apollos 9 through 17. Okay, I hope you all can see this. So the first thing that needs to happen for the Apollo missions, I'm going to go ahead and increase my picture here just a hair. There you go. The first thing that has to happen is that they need to test the lunar landing module. And then they're going to have to test how you get back to the moon with the lunar landing module. And then they're going to try and land. And so that's really the sequence that happened. So here's a launch of each of the, excuse me, here is a series, a mosaic of photographs of each of the launches of the various spacecraft that actually took off. One of the things you might notice is Apollo 12 here took off in very bad weather. And we're going to talk about that and some of the problems that arose from that. And then also, we might note that Apollo 17 took off at night, and this was the only night launch of the Saturn V rocket. Okay, so after Apollo 8 returned, there was a great deal of rush to get the lunar landing module ready. And the first ones were a little bit on the heavy side. So the first two went into Apollo 9 and then Apollo 10. And Apollo 9 mission was really called the LEM Shakedown. And it was flown by James McDivitt, who I'm showing a picture here, was the commander of the mission. And if you remember right, he flew in Gemini. Dave Scott was the command module pilot. He also flew in Gemini, if you recall. Jim McDivitt flew in Gemini 4. When Ed White did his spacewalk, he was the commander, and Dave Scott flew next to Neil Armstrong. Dave Scott was supposed to do a spacewalk, but after the Gemini 8 did its primary objective, which is to dock with the Agena spacecraft, they started spinning out of control. And eventually Neil Armstrong stabilized the spacecraft and brought them home. And Dave Scott was not able to do a spacewalk. And then we have the rookie, and that's Rusty Schweikert. Now, Rusty Schweikert was the Lunar Module pilot, and he and James McDivitt were supposed to do a series of spacewalks. And it was always designed that the command module pilot would always remain in the command module and remain in charge of the command module, sort of as a way of having an anchor individual watching the systems. Okay, the one thing that's interesting about Apollo 9, if you want some trivia, is that they actually had red helmets. And so you'll always see Apollo 9, if you see a mission with Apollo where the helmet's red, then you know that's Apollo 9. The other thing is that you can see the service module, the command module here, and then here is, I think, Rusty Schweikert sticking his head out of the command module. And this is a picture, I believe, taken by Jim McDivitt, looking, standing out of the porch of the lunar landing module. And so he was able to take a big picture with a nice Earth in the background. I think this is one of the most awesome pictures of the Apollo 9 mission. Here's an example of the lunar module that's still encased inside of the S4B booster, which was that third level, third stage of the Saturn V rocket. And you can see here's the docking area. And this right here is a little target, so that there's a little crosshairs on the windows of the command module. And then you see down in the front, in front of you is the docking mechanism. And so you're able to look through the window and you align your window with this docking target here. And that then means that you're putting your nose right into the right spot. Now, the beautiful thing was that they docked with the lunar landing module, they extracted it, and obviously that's happened by this point in time. And then they flew the lunar landing module in Earth orbit and tested its descent stage engine. They tested opening up the legs and doing all of the reaction control systems so they could yaw it and pitch it and change orbits with it. And I don't know how far away they flew from the command module, but I think they flew like something like 5 miles away, so that they were station keeping very far away. And then they broke off the ascent stage and discarded the descent stage. And so you can see here is the ascent engine on the bottom side of the ascent stage. And this area here with the legs has all been discarded. And here's the porch that you can get in and out of the lunar landing module. And so this is a picture taken by Dave Scott from the command module window, showing them getting ready to approach and dock the lunar landing module with the command module. So this is what James McDivitt called a full up mission. You know, James McDivitt was actually offered to fly the Apollo 8 mission to the moon because they were really in line for it. And it was Borman and Lovell and Anders who were supposed to fly the Apollo 9 mission. But, you know, when the NASA brass came up to McDivitt and said, we just want to send you to the moon, and would you like to have that mission? He said, no, I don't want that. I want Apollo 9. I mean, that's the mission where, you know, you're doing all the test flying. So this is a smorgasbord, full up test mission. And he just loved that idea. He had no interest in going to the moon and just taking a ride in the command module, doing nothing, flying to the moon. I don't know about you all, but I would have gone to the moon in a heartbeat and forget the full up test flight business. Okay, this mission happened in March of 1969. And if you recall, Apollo 8 went up basically in Christmas of 1968. So this is 3 months later they've accomplished this mission. And it's giving you a feeling for the pace at which Apollo is moving forward now. You know, they had October of 67 was Apollo 7. And then they had to wait a time because they had to get the spacecraft ready for the Saturn V. And then in 68, Apollo 8. And now March of 69, we have Apollo 9. So we haven't even taken the LEM to the moon yet. And yet here we are only a few months out from when they actually did the moon landing. So let's think about this. Let's take a pause here. You know, we've learned how to go to the moon and orbit around the moon and come back. Okay, that is a tremendous set of lessons. So we can check that down. Now we've done Apollo 9, and we've done a complete shakedown and tested the lunar landing module, and know that it's working in all ways. And we did basically Earth orbit rendezvous with the lunar lander. What do we have left? Well, we could go straight for the landing, but we might just want to go out to the moon again, take the lunar landing module with us, and do everything except do the landing. In other words, you know, push the systems all the way to the edge, but don't make the landing. Because the landing itself is really a whole another ball game, you know, when you're talking about actually flying in an over an airless ball of gravity that would pull you down. There's no room for error. So the fact that we could look, the people that were going to make that attempt would have the knowledge of everything up to that last bit, that last, you know, 2 steps to get down to the moon. That's the way NASA wanted to work this. So next up, Apollo 10, we're going to do what's called the dress rehearsal mission, everything but the landing. Now, mind you, they purposely left not enough fuel in the lunar landing ascent stage so that the astronauts would not just, oops, we landed on Apollo 10, because they would not be able to come home. So that was kind of built into that mission. Just to let you know, a lot of money got put into building Saturn V's. There were 11 more missions that could have flown. Yet NASA was so good, and the astronauts were so good, and the computer programmers were so good, the engineers were so good, the ground controllers who practiced this on the ground, everybody was so good that it only took them 2 more missions. Basically, it was a straight line getting there. Once Apollo 8 flew, it was a straight line getting to the moon. Okay, let's just remind you of this key milestones to getting to the moon. And basically, I want you to think of the fact is that Apollo 10 did all of these except for the landing. Okay, number 1, we launched the Saturn V. That's this picture here. Once we launch, we're in orbit. We go around twice. And while we're doing that, we check all of our systems, make everything's working just fine and perfectly. And then Houston radios up and says, you know, Apollo, whatever you are go for TLI, which means you are ready for the translunar injection burn. And if you remember right, by the time you get to orbit, you have your stack with your command module and your service module with your lunar landing module embedded at the top of the S4B booster. And it's the S4B booster then that you fire, and it pushes you out of Earth orbit and sends you on a trajectory to the moon. Of course, then you're now coasting on the way to the moon. Now, once you've gotten coasting from out here, this is when you will separate the command module service module stack, what I'll call the CSM. You separate that from the S4B. The shrouds open up on S4B, and then you turn around and you go in and you dock with the LEM and you pull it out. And so this is the point at which that happens, LEM docking. It doesn't happen in Earth orbit. It happens when you start your journey to the moon. And so here's a diagram of the astronauts pulling the LEM out of the S4B. At that point in time, you'll discard the S4B. They usually sort of fire some rockets on it to keep it away from the astronauts and their spacecraft, and also put it on a trajectory, usually to crash into the moon. At that point in time, the astronauts are flying in just this thing that's called the stack, if you will, the service module, the command module, and then the lunar landing module, docked here at the head of the lunar landing module. And you go into what's called PTC. Now, we talked about what PTC was. It's passive thermal control, or sometimes called barbecue mode. And you can see the spacecraft is put perpendicular to the sun and then is rotated around like on a barbecue. And so they basically just slowly get barbecue roasted all the way to the moon. And it's way that they let the cold side, the side away from the sun gets cold in the coldness of space, and the side that's toward the sun gets heated, and then it rotates around and cools off, and then comes back around and gets heated. And that's how they keep and passively control the temperature of the spacecraft. When they get here close to the moon, number 6 is they have to do what's called the Lunar Orbit Insertion Burn, LOI. And in this case, what they do is you're flying backwards toward the moon and you fire your rocket in a retro position, and it slows you down so that the moon's gravity can capture you. And so here we're showing the stack where you've got the limb, the CSM, and of course you can see it's flying backwards along its direction, and the SPS engine then fires to slow it down, and then once it stops firing, you're coasting, but you're captured now by the gravity of the moon, and you go into orbit. That's called lunar orbit insertion. Okay, now let's talk about the powered descent itself. Even though Apollo 10 didn't do this particular maneuver, Apollo 11 did, and this is how you got down to the moon. And I just want to share this with you one more time. We did show this diagram in the last lecture that basically described how you do lunar orbit rendezvous, or LOR, sorry. So we have the spacecraft going around this way, and the LEM is Lunar Landing Module is docked to the service module and the command module. And you're going around the orbit like this. And remember, the sun is in this direction and the Earth is in this direction. And because the Earth is in this direction, what you'll see is that whenever the spacecraft is along this part of the orbit, it's in radio blackout. And we came up with a couple 3-letter acronyms for that too. When you move from radio contact out of radio contact, so this is in radio contact, this is out of radio contact, that's called loss of signal, LOS. And as the spacecraft moves through this blocked area of radio contact and emerges from it, where it can have now radio contact with the Earth through that direct line of sight, that's called acquisition of signal, AOS. So I'm going to show you is that nothing happens really during the blackout area. They've designed this all so that the sun angle is perfect for the astronauts to get very good contrast of the landing field, and also to make sure that all the key maneuvers are happening while they're in radio contact. So here we're coming around, we undock here in the sun where we can see everything. And so the sunlight's coming in this way. And here we have, of course, the spacecraft can see each other very well in the sun. And this is where the command module pilot in the command module inspects visually through the window that the lunar landing module seems like everything is A-okay. When that happens, then there's a small burn from the lunar landing module, and it separates and gets itself far away from the command module. And then by the time it orbits around here, just before it would orbit into an area of loss of signal, LOS, it does what's called DOI, the descent orbit insertion. This is a burn, again, which slows the lunar landing module down, and it can then fall down into this lower orbit, which would be this orbit here. However, when they get to their closest approach, they do something called PDI, which is called the powered descent insertion burn. And this allows them then to fall even further. And then eventually they get to the point where they're landing. And as they get to this small area down here, you can see that they do something called pitch over. So they're flying along, and they're flying along backwards like this. And then they get to the point where they're ready to descend, and they pitch over so that they're now straight up and down. So the astronauts are really on their side all this time until they get to this point where they pitch over. And when they pitch over, then they begin to do a vertical descent. And all this while, the descent booster is firing, slowing them down, slowing them down, slowing them down, and then they touch down. And they're going only a few feet per second by the time they hit. On the bottom of one of the legs is an antenna that's hanging down. And when that antenna touches the ground, there's a blue light that goes on in the cockpit. It's called the contact light. And that tells the astronauts that they're actually now within about 1.5 feet of the lunar surface. And in Apollo 11, at one point in time, you will actually hear Buzz Aldrin say, "Contact light," meaning we're there. Okay. Okay, so this is I think a fairly good description of what's going on there. Now, this is what it might look like if you were able to watch it happen. And in space, you don't get to see the exhaust come out because there's no smoke, there's no air, there's no wind, and there's no burning of the air or oxidation in order to emit light that would allow you to see the gases coming out. This is just an example of the sequence of events during the powered descent phase of the flight. And you can see everything's down to 0.1 seconds here, okay? And relative to the time of ignition and elapsed time from the liftoff, I mean, this is literally mission elapsed time down to the 1/10 of a second. So since you lifted off from Earth down to a 1/10 of a second, you know, what we're doing with the landing radar, okay? We're gonna yaw. We're going to have the landing radar data check. We're going to see if it's good. You know, we are going to throttle down. You know, first landing point redesignation. In other words, if things need to be checked out on our position, we're going to recalculate. It just goes on and on and on. Finally, engine shut down. And then once they do set the spacecraft down and let it settle, you would think, hurrah, I'm going to celebrate. But no, instantly they hit another checklist. They got to check all the systems. Is this good? Is this good? Is the fuel good? You know, are we balanced good? Are the legs holding? There's a whole series of checklists for what they call a go, no go situation. And if anything didn't check out on that list right after they land, they're supposed to take off immediately. But everything checked out with the Eagle. That was the name of the spacecraft of Apollo 11. Okay. Okay, so you're on the moon. You do your little walk on the moon. You have a good time. You plant your flags, do your little science experiments. You go back into the LIM. You repressurize it, and you get ready to take off. And you can see this is the descent stage here. You can see the legs, and this is the ladder. And then you come up into the porch. This is the ascent stage, and as you've seen in previous images, there's a rocket down here. I think you can see that in the Apollo 9 mission. And then this just lifts off this and leaves this bottom pad here, and up it goes. And so if it was landed here and it flies up and gets into this lower orbit, and it would completely stay in this orbit, but if you remember right, there is something called the terminal phase, you know, insertion or something like that. I can't remember the full name of it, but you're basically fire the rocket to come up and then rendezvous with the command module as it's orbiting around, and then you dock with it. And then here's an example of that. You come up and then you dock with it. And once you dock with it, then what's going to happen is they're going to jettison the lunar landing module, and then they fire some rockets on it to get it to descend down and crash into the moon. And by this time, the astronauts have put some seismic detectors on the moon, and they have actually been able to measure the seismic activity of that crash. So now the lunar orbit is just occupied by the astronauts in the command service module, and then they eventually fire this SPS engine at the right time. They do something called the trans-Earth injection, TEI burn, and that sends them away from the moon, puts them in a trajectory toward the Earth, and they're heading home. So as I was talking here, you might be docked and you're orbiting around, and then you do the limb jettison. The limb jettison goes down. So here's an example of the limb jettison right here. And the astronauts are staying inside of the command service module. And then you come back around and they do what's called the Tei Burn. So this is a picture of what that might look like. You fire the rocket in the direction that the spacecraft is orbiting, and you pick up some delta V. In other words, you increase your velocity so that you can escape the gravity of the moon, and you start heading back toward the Earth. Again, on this red line here, you basically have to go into thermal control mode, or PTC, passive thermal control, which is the barbecue mode. And so here's your service command module flying home by itself and just orbiting around. And this is a really spectacular time for the astronauts because you might remember from the movie the overview effect they talked about Ed White from Apollo 14. And as the lunar module pilot, he'd done all of his work. And so his trip home, he was pretty much a passenger. And he sat there in the window as the spacecraft rotated in PTC and watched the Earth go by, and watched the moon go by, and watched the Earth go by, you know, again and again and again for like 2 days, and looked at all of the stars and just had all of this time to think about this overview effect feeling that he was experiencing. And he really had a very profound version of the overview effect. Now you're coming in, you're picking up speed as you get closer to the Earth, a lot of speed. You're heading in probably around somewhere between 24 and 34,000 miles per hour. Now, you may have noticed that I can never get that right. I think it's 24,000 miles per hour and 34,000 feet per second or per hour. I really can't remember the number. I apologize. I should have done my research, but it's fast, okay? But I think it's around 24,000 miles per hour, actually, even though I keep writing 34. As you're coming in, you're really picking up speed. So the time that is passing is, it's a very quick crossing of this area here. You're moving in very, very fast. And so while you're coming in and picking up great amount of speed, you have to get rid of the service module because the heat shield is on the bottom of the command module, that blunt end of it. And so here's a picture, and you can barely just see there's some reaction control system rockets here that are firing to separate this command module from the service module. The service, and I know it looks like this thing is just sitting here in space, but at this point it's moving at 20,000 miles per hour coming in at the Earth at just the right angle. And so this thing ends up burning up in the atmosphere, and we have no leftover remnants of any of the service modules. They burned up in the atmosphere. Now, as you're coming in here, there's something called a re-entry corridor. And that means that basically there's about a 2-degree angle at which you can get it right. You're coming in and you have to hit the atmosphere at just within this 2-degree angle. If you come in too steep, you'll slow down too rapidly and you'll literally burn up. If you come in too shallow, it's like a rock skipping on a pond and off you go. Now, you may have noticed that the only thing that's going to come across that's coming into the atmosphere is the command module. The command module is just this. Ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't have any rockets on it. It has some small reaction control system, rockets that are very small for rotating it and stabilizing it. It does not have a large rocket engine on it. So if you come in and you skip off, that's it. There is no second chance. You are going to basically go into orbit around the sun, and eventually your batteries and oxygen will run out. And did I fail to mention that you only have somewhere on the order of 15 minutes to 30 minutes of batteries in the command module? Because when you jettisoned the service module, you now have gotten rid of your oxygen tanks. You have gotten rid of your fuel cells. You've gotten rid of everything that gives you electrical power. All you have left now are some batteries that power the command module long enough for you to re-enter the atmosphere, and hopefully enough juice in those batteries to jettison your parachutes. So you're really down to the nitty-gritty. The engineering is within such small margins of error. And if anything really went out of the envelope of plan, the astronauts could really be stranded and not make it. So these were special individuals that really had a great deal of faith of all the engineers that touched every screw, that turned every bolt, that twisted every electrical wire. Okay, so you can see here that they're coming in very quickly and they're doing what's called the re-entry. Eventually, this is a huge plasma ball as the heat shield behind there is ablating that temperature. Again, getting us up to 3,000 to 5,000 degrees, which is hotter than the surface of the sun. And then eventually, during this time, they have loss of signal because the radio can't penetrate this ion plasma that's surrounding the command module. And eventually they come through the atmosphere, the parachutes come out, and they gently splash down on the ocean. Again, there's the anatomy of a moon mission. Okay, we talked about Apollo 7, the shakedown of the Block 2 command module. And then we talked about Apollo 8, the first trip to the moon and back. We talked about Apollo 9, the Earth orbit shakedown of the lunar landing module. And now we're going to talk about going back to the moon and let's get this done. And then we're going to talk about the first few moon landings that are sort of, in a sense, phase 2 of the Apollo program. So Apollo 10. Apollo 10 happened in May of 1969. Now remember, Apollo 9 happened in March, April, May. 2 months later, they get up and put everything back together, and boom, that crew's in there and up they go to the moon. Second moon mission. This is the first moon mission with the lunar landing module, the LEM, and they do everything in Apollo 11's mission except they don't do the landing. Apollo 11, the landing. Everybody knows about Apollo 11, okay? July 1969, May, June, July. 2 months later. We're popping these missions off 2 months at a time, okay? It's pretty spectacular considering that, in January of 1967, there was a fire that grounded the entire Apollo program. Okay, first landing on the moon, and we'll talk about the fact that they landed downstream by about 4 miles from target. Now, the geologists really wanted to do some science on the moon, and that meant they really needed the astronauts to land where they planned for them to land, not just 4 miles down the road, okay? So Apollo 12, they spent a great deal of time working on developing a way to do precision landing. Now, if you read Andrew Chaikin's book, A Man on the Moon, the Apollo 12 mission is an amazing story of how they threw down a target on the moon that they were going to land next to, and everybody would know they failed if they didn't get within it and close to it. This was the Surveyor 3 spacecraft that had soft landed on the moon before the Apollo projects, and Pete Conrad said, I'm going to land within 500 yards of it, and lo and behold, he landed within 300 yards of it. So it was the first precision landing, and that opened up the Apollo program then for making precision landings, and now they could really try to land in some more dangerous places. The interesting thing about Apollo 11 was it landed in the Sea of Tranquility, which is a vast, flat mare, if you will, of soft, flat moon regolith. And so there was really not a lot of hills or rivers or anything like that, and no big rocks. So it really turned out that this was, the first landing was designed to be that way, but the geologists wanted to push for, let's land on the side of a mountain. And they had to really learn how to do precision flying. Apollo 13, very famous, a movie from Ron Howard based upon it, starring Tom Hanks. Now look, if you want to learn more about what the launch of the Saturn V rocket is like, that movie has a spectacular launch sequence from the liftoff to the jettisoning of the first stage, igniting the second stage, the lifting off of the escape tower, and then the staging into the S4B, and then the last push up into orbit, and what they call SECO, second engine cutoff. And there are 12 minutes, 43 seconds, boom, they're weightless. Spectacular sequence. Also, there's a lot of other aspects about the mission that you really end up, now that you've seen this lecture, I think you will get a great deal more out of that movie than if you've just watched it blindly. Apollo 13 was called the successful failure. One of the oxygen tanks in the service module exploded when they were about 2/3 of the way to the moon, and the crew literally, through their intelligence and their emotional intelligence to stay calm, were able to get themselves home alive. Also, the fact that the engineering of, even though the engineering was at fault for the explosion, the engineering of the lunar landing module and the command module was spectacular and really saved their lives. There are people who argue that if the fire hadn't happened on Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed Chaffee, Roger Chaffee, Ed White had not sacrificed their lives, that the engineering of the command module would not have been up to snuff to bring home the Apollo 13 astronauts. So that saved their lives. Apollo 14. Now, after Apollo 13 flew, obviously this is a failure for NASA. You've got to sideline everything, put it on hold, do an analysis, study why the failure happened. When they get back up, they've got to make it happen. If they have 2 failures in a row, it could absolutely destroy any future chances for Apollo missions. So in Apollo 14, they actually brought back Al Shepard, who, if you remember right, only has 15 minutes of space exposure or experience flying in his Friendship 7 or Freedom 7 spacecraft in a suborbital flight. He hasn't even learned how to orbit the Earth. It's a long story, but a great one, and you should read it in Andrew Chaikin's book. And this is a story where Al Shepard actually had an inner ear problem, and I think it's called Meniere's syndrome, and it made him spin out of control. He got grounded to the point where he was not even allowed to fly one of his jets. So he still refused to give up. He had a risky operation, and when the operation worked, he went right to Deke Slayton, who was the astronaut boss, and he said, "I'm ready to fly." And he wanted Apollo 13, and he almost got Apollo 13. But the NASA brass said, "No, we got to push him back. He's a rookie," kind of, which insulted Al Shepard. So we have definitely got to push him back and give him more time to train. So in the end, it was Al Shepard who was the commander of Apollo 14. And his ego is so big, there's no way he's going to fly with astronauts who have more space experience than he does. So guess what? He picked 2 rookies to be on his mission with him. So sometimes this mission is jokingly called the retread, Al Shepard, and the 2 rookies. Now, this is interesting because I got some pictures of Ed White trying to walk on the moon, and he's got a map and he's lost, and I find it's a hoot. Okay, so let's talk about Apollo 10 briefly. Again, everything about 11 except for the landing. They brought the lunar landing module within 50,000 feet of the moon. Now, if you've flown in an airplane at 30,000 feet, you're about 3/5 of the way up, so you can look down at the Earth from those airplanes, and you can think of yourself being a little bit further up and flying above the moon, except there's no atmosphere, so it's absolutely crystal clear. Commander was Tom Stafford, this gentleman right here. He flew with Wallace Schirra on Gemini 6. John Young was the command module pilot. And if you remember, John Young has already flown in space twice, okay? He was the on Gemini 3 with Gus Grissom. He's the one who smuggled the corned beef sandwich on board Gemini 3. And then he also, I believe, was the commander of Gemini 11 when Mike Collins flew with him. I can't remember if it was 10 or 11, but I think it was 11. And then we have Gene Cernan, and this is Gene Cernan's first time in space. He was the rookie. So he was the lunar landing module pilots. Okay, so here's a picture of the command module and service module taken from the LEM. Here's a picture of the LEM taken from the command module. And you can see that everything's good to go. They've done the separation, they've done the inspection, and then at one point in time, they go ahead and do the insertion for the lower orbit. Here's a picture of the command module. Interestingly, I haven't talked about spacecraft names too much. The last time you heard of a spacecraft name was the unsinkable Molly Brown when it was Gemini 3. And then NASA hated that name so much, they said, no more spacecraft names. And for Apollo 7, no spacecraft name. For Apollo 8, no spacecraft name. But when Apollo 9 flew, there was the LEM and the command module, and they were separate, so they had to have call names. So Jim McDivitt called his command module Gumdrop, because you can see the command module kind of looks like a gumdrop. And he called the lunar landing module Spider. So Gumdrop and Spider. So Gumdrop, this is Spider. Spider, this is Gumdrop. NASA wasn't too crazy about those names, but they stuck. Now, Apollo 10, they have to have names too. So what do? They call it Charlie Brown and Snoopy. So the command module is called Charlie Brown and the LEM was called Snoopy. Okay, so sense of humor here. All right. So anyway, as Snoopy's going down, it goes within about 50,000 feet. They've tested everything. Again, then they jettison the descent stage. They check out the navigation system for the ascent stage before they fire it. And it turned out that they had a couple switches wrong. Okay, they have two what they call orientation platforms, and they had both of them turned on. And this confused the ascent stage of the LEM, and it started to spin. And that kind of scared the astronauts, Stafford and Cernan, a little bit. Cernan is known to have said a few swear words live on the radio, but they got it under control. They brought it home, and that was really the only glitch in the mission. So Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal, proved that lunar orbit rendezvous could happen. So if you think about it, lunar orbit rendezvous was, instigated in 1961, and everything was built to see if it would work. It wasn't until Apollo 10 that it was actually demonstrated that it will work. So everything is set now for Apollo 11. 2 months later, Apollo 11 flies in July of 1969. And this was obviously, I don't need to name these characters, Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin. Armstrong, the commander, Collins, the commander, command module pilot, and then the Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. So it was Armstrong and Aldrin that went down, the commander and the lunar module pilot. And unfortunately, we only have 4 photographs of Neil Armstrong on the moon. This is one of them right here of the 4. The rest of the photographs Armstrong took of Aldrin. So you have all of these photographs of Aldrin on the moon, but the first man on the moon, there's only 4 pictures of, and none of them are of him directly. They're always these sort of in the background kind of things. And Buzz Aldrin took a lot of flack for that. Some people think that he was just a little bit too miffed about not getting, as he said in quotes, the brass ring. And it turned out that before they flew, though Buzz Aldrin will downplay this in interviews, he did campaign to get to be the first person to step out of the LEM and walk on the moon. But he lost that battle, mostly because the commander's in charge, and Neil Armstrong basically said, I understand the historical significance of getting out first, and that ended the conversation. Okay, So here's Buzz Aldrin in front of the flag. This is a very, very famous picture. Here's Buzz Aldrin. They've already deployed the flag, and he's putting up something called the ALSEP, which is a series of experiments that are laid out, one of them being a reflector that if you shoot a laser at the moon, it will reflect the light right back at you. Okay, this is a charged particle cosmic ray collector. There's Neil Armstrong doing something in the bay on the descent module stage. Now, there's a spacecraft called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, and it was the first orbiting spacecraft to have the ability to take pictures with a high enough resolution of the lunar surface to actually see the leftover lunar module descent stage pads, and it actually could see the footprints of the astronauts. Now, the images I'm showing in my slide deck here are not the most high resolution versions. If you go on the internet, it turns out that they since then had brought the spacecraft down to a lower orbit to get even higher resolution images. And you can actually see, not the individual footprints, but it turns out that there's a much higher resolution image of this area here. Here's where the limb is. And if you read the book by Chaikin, you'll find out that Neil Armstrong silently made a run from the limb out to this crater called Little West Crater and looked down into it and picked up some rock around the crater. And interestingly, that little escapade, Neil Armstrong will say, was the only true unplanned exploration that he was able to do on the moon, because everything else was timed out just down to the second. So if you look at this area here, this is a diagram of the landing site. And we have basically this area where you have what's called the toss zone. Basically, they threw everything out. There's a great story that when they got done and depressurized for the last time and threw out all their urine bags and all that stuff like that, that the seismic detector they put on captured the impact of the stuff they threw out. And Houston radioed up and they said, we just noticed that you threw everything out of the limb. We got a seismic signal, and Neil Armstrong is known to have radioed back and said, darn, you can't get away with anything anymore. So kind of some NASA humor for you. So this area is the most densely area of activity, okay? And there's a small little double crater here. You can see it right there and right there. And then they put some data devices here. You can see them shining right there. And this is the area where Neil Armstrong ran to Little West Crater and then ran back. And I've seen images from the LRO where you can actually see his footpath through here. It's pretty amazing. Okay, so I need not say much more about Apollo 11. Everybody knows, that it was a spectacular success. The landing itself was highly dramatic. There was a computer glitch that happened because Buzz Aldrin, it's a long story, and I have you watching a movie called To the Moon by Nova, and in that it talks about the story about why that happened, and you should really watch that movie. It does a great job of showing all of the landing steps that were involved. But they had something called a 1202 alarm, and they were scared that they would have to abort, and they learned that they didn't, and they continued on through the alarm. And it was really because Buzz Aldrin had left two systems running at the same time. One was the rendezvous radar, and the other one was the altitude radar, which is pointing down at the ground, feeding them the altitude. Now, look, the computers were less powerful than your cell phone by orders of magnitude. It could not handle taking in data from both radars, and it kept screwing the computer up as an overload. Imagine, like, when you're working on your laptop and it just starts to freeze. That's what we're talking about. And so this happens when the computer's trying to figure out and make all these calculations as they're descending down to the moon. And it turned out that they were able to brave through it and get through it. There's also the story, I can't help myself, that they didn't depressurize the tunnel between the limb and the command module before they released the command module from the lunar landing module, and that when that air opened up, it pushed the lunar landing module about 6 miles per second or 6 kilometers per second faster than it was supposed to be. And I think it was per hour. But the point was, it was pushing the spacecraft, and they had a certain limit on the velocity that the spacecraft's supposed to go across the moon, and it was halfway to the abort limit because of that extra little impetus that it received. So just the smallest little mistakes, and we could have aborted. Part of the reason that they landed 4 miles downstream from where they were supposed to was on account of that little accident. Okay, Apollo 12. So now we're in November of 1996. We've slowed the pace down just a little bit. NASA took a breather, and the ticker tape celebrations, the world tours, the cigars, the champagne. So all that happened for a while. And Apollo 12 lands. And again, this becomes the first precision landing because they no more of this landing 4 miles downstream stuff. Now, Apollo 12 was commanded by an all-Navy crew. Pete Conrad was the commander. He flew in Gemini 5. Richard Gordon, I think, flew in 10, and he did the spacewalk in 10. And then Alan Bean was a rookie who almost just never flew an Apollo, but he had been a student of Pete Conrad's, and Pete Conrad had saved him from, an assignment that they called Apollo Purgatory, and Alan Bean then got to walk on the moon with his instructor, Pete Conrad. Here is a picture of Alan Bean on the moon, and there's no movies. There was a color movie camera that was taken on Apollo 12, but Alan Bean accidentally pointed it into the sun, so they had no movies of Apollo 12, just a radio show. Here's Alan Bean getting out of the limb, coming down from the porch, and then here they are deploying some of the science experiments. This here is the Surveyor 3 spacecraft, and Pete Conrad's goal was to land within 500 yards of it, and he landed, as you can see, here's the lunar landing module. He landed within 300 yards of it. If you look at the LRO image, here's the Surveyor spacecraft, landed in the edge of the Surveyor crater, and then here's where the Intrepid landed. So they called their command module the Yankee Clipper, and they called their lunar landing module the Intrepid. You can see here where they're deploying the ALSEP, that's the picture right here. And then you can see the footprints, that the paths that they walked, and you can see that they walked down here. That's pretty good. And they have even higher resolution images of this now. Okay. One of the things they did was they cut off the camera arm and brought the camera back home. So that was kind of their prize for that. So they did some good science, a little geology, came home. Now, this mission really almost didn't happen. When Apollo 12 lifted off, it lifted off during a storm, a thunderstorm. And as it lifted off, there was so much ions built up in the exhaust from the rocket that it attracted the lightning, and lightning struck the Saturn V during liftoff, not once, but twice. Now get this, when the lightning struck the command module, it knocked all of the systems offline in the command module, okay? So all of a sudden now, the little 8 balls that tell them the orientations are swinging freely, all the lights are blinking, all the electricity is off, okay? It was total mayhem. They had absolutely no control of the command module. What they were worried about was that whatever knocked the navigation system of the command module offline, that it would knock off the navigation platform for the Saturn I booster for the main stage, because it had a computer in it, and it had gyroscopes that tell its orientation that then will control it so it can roll and so it can pitch as it comes up. If those had been knocked offline, they would have been on a wild ride. 7.5 million pounds of thrust going who knows where. But fortunately, those did not get knocked offline. Only the command module got knocked offline. Now, It turns out that during this mayhem, as they're flying at rapid speed, there was a John Aaron down in the command center at Houston who had seen all of this go off. And he radioed up to Alan Bean and he said, change AXE or ASE to auxiliary. And so this was some esoteric switch that it turned out that the flight director didn't even know what that meant. And Alan Bean was the only one who knew what it meant of the crew. Dick Gordon didn't know what it meant. Pete Conrad didn't know what it meant. So anyway, Alan Bean switches this switch and it moved all the systems to an auxiliary power and they all came back online. So after all the power came back online, they got into orbit and they had to reorient the platform and recalibrate it so they knew what the platform was and they had their 8 balls set. They basically had to, it's a way they know how they are three-dimensionally in space. It's called aligning the platform. Once they aligned the platform, they checked out all the systems and everything seemed fine. But there was one last thing that they didn't know about. Down in Mission Control, they were thinking they should bring them home because they weren't sure whether the pyrotechnics, which released the parachutes, hadn't been already jettisoned off and had been basically compromised. And they didn't know, and there was no way to test it. There was no way to know. So they cogitated over this, and they realized, well, if the parachutes aren't going to come out when we bring them home now, then the parachutes aren't going to come out if we bring them home after they complete their moon mission. So let's do the moon mission, and we'll worry about the parachutes when they come home. And that's what they did. So they did their moon mission, and it turned out that the parachutes worked and everybody was happy. They came home safe. So that is Apollo 12. Now, if you also want to get some more insight in Apollo 12, besides reading Andrew Chaikin's book, which of course is amazing, you need to go watch HBO's From the Earth to the Moon. I think the second episode is the Apollo 12 mission. And they do a fantastic job of showing you what the personality of this crazy astronaut, Pete Conrad, was like. He was really a fun-loving guy. You would just wonder if he took anything in the world seriously. But I think it just is an indication of his extreme intelligence that everything was easy for him. You know, life, going to the moon, it's like he was a hot knife and everything else was just butter. It just no challenge for him whatsoever. Okay, Apollo 13. We all know Apollo 13 was the mission which was the successful failure. And there's a great movie on that as well if you want to watch it. What happened in this case was in the service module, the second oxygen tank exploded. Now, what happened was of the astronauts, who was Jim Lovell commanding, Jack Schweikert, command module pilot, and Fred Hayes, lunar module pilot, there was a point in time when they were getting ready to go bed at night, and NASA asked them to flip a switch, which would stir the oxygen tank so that they didn't settle down and they stayed sort of evenly distributed inside these spherical tanks. He hit that switch, and it turned out that there was some problems with the electronics inside the tank, which had been set into motion several years earlier. I'm not going to get into that whole thing. You can read about it on Wikipedia. But that caused the explosion when the electronics arced inside there, a little spark, and kabam, blew out half of the spacecraft. You can see here when they finally jettisoned the service module as they were about to re-enter Earth, you can see where the area was exploded and blown away. This happened while they're on their way out to the moon, about 2/3 the way out to the moon. So they had the option of turning around and firing the SPS engine, that's this engine right here, and coming straight home, and NASA thought it was too risky, that the engine might be compromised, and if they fired it, it might explode. They were able to then just do a free return trajectory around the moon and come home. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough oxygen and electricity to get home. The command module, as you heard, once the service module power shuts down, the command module has about 15 minutes of battery power left in it because it's all meant for that re-entry phase of the mission. They had to shut the command module down in order to save those batteries. They climbed into the lunar landing module that served as a life raft, but it only had enough power and oxygen in it for 2 people for 45 hours. And they needed to have it for some 113 or 115 hours for 3 people. It just wasn't going to make it. So they did all kinds of crazy maneuvers to get home earlier, to preserve the oxygen, shut everything down. You've got to watch the movie. But the end of it is that they make it home. Here's the picture of them when they get back in the spacecraft. Quite the Odyssey, if you will, which, by the way, was the name of their command module. They called it the Odyssey, and they called their lunar module the Aquarius. Here's the plaque for the Aquarius that was on its leg that they were supposed to put there when they landed on the moon. And unfortunately, that never did get placed on the moon. One of the things that they had to worry about was that they were building up carbon dioxide because they have these filters called scrubbers, and they didn't have enough scrubbers for 3 people for that 100 hours. But they had a lot of scrubbers left over in the command module. So they used up the scrubbers in the lunar landing module, but those were round cylinders, and they had to figure out how to get the command module scrubbers to work. And the command module scrubbers were these big squares or cubes. So here's a command module scrubber here. And so one of the big things was that they had to monkey rig or jerry rig a way for the air to be filtered through these things, for which there was no direct way to get the air to do that. And that was one of the highlights of the saving of these astronauts, was developing this way to do this. Anyhow, they came home safely, and it's a fantastic movie. You really should watch it. And this mission in April of 1970 really scared NASA. It really scared everybody that they might lose an astronaut in space. And again, you can read on Wikipedia all of the events that led up to why that oxygen tank exploded. Okay, last but not least here, we have Apollo 14. And Apollo 14 again was Alan Shepard, the retread, and his 2 rookies, Stuart Roosa, who was command module pilot, and Edgar Mitchell, who heard of from the overview effect, who was the lunar module pilot. In this case, they landed, and they were supposed to walk this large traverse and come up to the edge of Cone Crater, and they wanted to look into the Cone Crater. That was going to be their reward for that walk. It was like 1.5 kilometers. As they walked up, it turns out they never did get over the edge, but they got very close to it. And now with the LRO images, you can see where their footprints were. They literally were just within the edge of looking over the crater, which it's too bad for them. I wish they had succeeded. But the fact of the matter is their maps were not high enough resolution for them to understand when they were looking this way or looking that way what they were seeing. And so I love this. They have this picture of Ed White that was taken by Alan Shepard. Here's Ed White looking at his map, completely lost on the moon. Here he is with his map walking around. I just get a hoot laughing about these pictures of Ed White walking around the moon with his map, not knowing exactly where he is. This is a very famous picture of Alan Shepard holding the American flag. And one thing that happened with Apollo 14 was that they decided they wanted to be able to tell the commander from the lunar module pilot. And so the commander was given these red stripes on his arms and his legs. You can see them here on Alan Shepard. And in this image, which is a fake image, it's a painting, it's showing Alan Shepard playing golf on the moon. And yes, Alan Shepard was an avid golfer, and he took a golf ball, a couple of golf balls, to the moon. He then had a certain type of device that he was able to pop the bottom off, and he had the bottom of a 7-iron or something like that connected to that. And he played golf on the moon. The first shot he hit was horrible, but the second shot, which he hit with one hand, apparently he said went miles and miles and miles. So ladies and gentlemen, there's a couple golf balls out there on the moon near the Apollo 14 landing site. And to this day, apparently nobody knows what brand of golf ball he hit. So, you should start studying engineering and figure out a way to get up to the Apollo 14 landing site so you can get that golf ball and sell it for millions of dollars on eBay. Right, okay. The other thing I wanted to tell you about Apollo 14 was it also was almost aborted. As you remember, after TLI, the next stage of the mission is to do the limb extraction from the S4B. And it turned out there was a little piece of dust caught in the docking ring. And so when Stu Rusa flew up and did the docking, they wouldn't latch. And he did it several times and they wouldn't latch. And they literally knew that they were just going to have to abort the mission and come home if they couldn't make that docking. They finally did it by getting the two spacecraft to touch and then hitting the docking mechanism manually so that it captured, and it eventually did capture. And apparently that got the piece of dust out of there. So when they undocked in lunar orbit and then docked again through the lunar orbit rendezvous maneuvers before and after the landing, everything went fine. So that's February of 1971. Now, I'm a rock and roll fan. I love Led Zeppelin. I think they're one of the best set of musicians that ever got together in rock and roll. And it turns out that they, on their second album, decided they wanted to have a picture of Neil Armstrong. So this is a cover of their second album. And you can see it's kind of got this World War I motif to it. And here's the band members right here. And then some actors and famous people, and followed by a series of other people that they knew involved in their management, etc. And this person here is this image here, is this image here. And as you can see, this is an image of Frank Borman. And in fact, that's exactly what the artist for the album did. They had a picture of Frank Borman and they put it on there. It turns out that this artist was confused about who Borman was and who Neil Armstrong was. And they didn't have Google and the internet back in those days. Probably was trying to figure out who was the first commander on the way to the moon, and somehow ended up getting Frank Borman's picture. And so Frank Borman has been immortalized on the cover of Led Zeppelin 2. Later on, when they were making some greatest hits albums, they decided to dress up in some spacesuits. Of course, we have the commander here, Robert Plant. And then you might recognize this as the patch for Apollo 14. If I come back here, here's the patch for Apollo 14. This is the astronaut pen flying to the moon. Having the astronaut pen fly to the moon was their way of saying the whole astronaut office is flying with us. We're coming back off of Apollo 13, and in spirit, we're bringing all of the astronauts. Now, as you'll also notice, they have the astronaut pen, then they have the Led Zeppelin, and then we have here the leftover image of the From the Earth to the Moon from Jules Verne, which is a nice shout out to Jules Verne. So I love it that Led Zeppelin made a shout out to Apollo 14, and I love it that they made a shout out to what they thought was Neil Armstrong. And as I said down here, if you don't believe the story, just Google it. And so I'd like to say that the spacecraft payload contains Led Zeppelin 2. I better write that down, Led Zeppelin 2. Okay. Okay, let's move on to phase 3. And phase 3 is what we call the science phase. Okay, and in the science phase, the astronauts got very, very serious about doing geology. Now I'm going to have you watch a movie for the class called To the Moon. It's a NOVA movie. I was able to find a kind of rundown version of it on YouTube that you can watch. And it really talks about this phase where Apollo transitions from phase 2, which is sort of footsteps and flags, to phase 3, which is science. And again, this is really a quick evolution that it parallels the sea race that we talked about when finally in the 1700s, Captain Cook actually went and did missions that were strictly about doing science, like studying the transit of Venus or finding some geographical locations, having people do botany from the various places around the world. And so you have this transition from discovery and exploitation, in that case, to actual science. With the moon, it was really footsteps and flags in a way, which was really a way of marking our territory and saying, you know, we won the high ground, which really what Apollo was about. But a transition happened between Apollo 13 and 15. And there was an astronaut scientist who was hired on. So they'd actually gotten the 5th class of astronauts that were scientists, physicists, you know, geologists. And one of them was a geologist. His name was, nickname was Dr. Rock, as Harrison Schmidt. And he wanted to get the astronauts to start doing some science, doing some geology on the planet, on the moon. So he hired his old Caltech professor, Dr. Lee Silver, to take the astronauts out and teach them how to do field geology. And it turned out that Al Shepard wasn't interested in this stuff. So, you know, Apollo 14 really didn't do any good, like, science in the sense of really documenting their findings well, so that they could be studied in context, as well as just, you know, the practices that geologists do to make sure that all of their samples are documented well. It was Dave Scott who was going to command Apollo 15. And if you remember, Dave Scott flew on Apollo 11 as the command module pilot. Dave Scott flew on Apollo 10 as the command module pilot with John Young and Tom Stafford. And he also flew on Gemini 8 with Neil Armstrong, the one that spun out of control and did the first docking. Now, Dave Scott really embraced the idea of doing science, and he set the tone for Apollo 15, which then set the tone for Apollo 16 and Apollo 17. And eventually Dr. Rock got to fly, and he flew on Apollo 17. And I'll tell you that story as it comes. Now, if you remember right, the second mission of Captain Cook, he named his ship the Endeavour. And this did not escape Dave Scott, and he decided that he was going to then name his command module the Endeavour after Captain Cook's ship. And so that was a shout out to science that had been transitioned to 200 years ago, now being transitioned to for lunar science and lunar observations. So I love that story. He also named his lunar landing module the Falcon. So it was the Endeavour and the Falcon. This mission, they built up the weight capacity for the Saturn V, and they put the rover down in the bay of the descent module. So this was the first mission to take the rover, which was kind of a little car that drove around on the moon. And they had a rover also in Apollo 16 and in Apollo 17. So this was the first real geology on the moon. And they were supposed to find a special rock, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. And they called it the Genesis rock, and lo and behold, they found it. This is also the first time that they had the 3-day stay on the moon. Apollo 16, which flew next, John Young flew in Apollo 10 to the moon. So he'd already been to the moon, Okay, so Jim Lovell was the first person that had flown out to the moon twice, once in 8 and once in 13, never landing on it. John Young flew out in 10 and then commanded in Apollo 16 and landed and walked on the moon. So he was the second person to fly to the moon twice. He flew with Charlie Duke, and he also flew with Ken Mattingly, who was the command module pilot. And Ken Mattingly was supposed to fly on Apollo 13 and got knocked off for measles. You'll see that in the movie. And then he got reassigned to the Apollo 16 prime crew. So he actually got to fly to the moon without almost getting killed because they thought he might have the measles before Apollo 13. Then Apollo 17 was in December of 1972. This was the last mission to the moon. This was the only scientist that practiced this science on the moon. A full up mission. Interesting, they found some interesting soil that had never been found, which really was an indication that there was so much more to discover on the moon that, and now we were just going to stop. So this was a very sad ending. Anyway, phase 3, which I'll call the science phase, 15, 16, and 17. So here's Apollo 15, and we have Dave Scott, Al Worden, and Jim Irwin. Jim Irwin walked on the moon with Dave Scott, and Al Worden flew the command module. So they landed in some place that was called the Apennine Mountains in Hadley Rill. So here are the mountains. This is the first time that anybody had landed near the mountains or near any geological feature, which let's just say that if you had landed in it and weren't able to do precision landing, you'd be in trouble. So they landed over here relative to Hadley Rill, which is actually quite large. It must have been spectacular to walk over here and look down into the rill. As you can see, they landed at a very steep angle for a command module, or I'm sorry, for a lunar lander to land at. I'm sure that was a little bit on the uncomfortable side, but the gravity is pretty light there, so maybe not so badly. And here they are with the rover for the first time. And the rock that they found was right here sitting on this little pedestal, waiting for them to find it, just sitting there. And this is what it looks like after you get the moon dust off. And this is a piece of regolith called ornithosite. And ornithosite was expected to be the original crust of the moon when it formed, before anything got beat down, before it got heated up by meteorites or anything like that. But when it actually was at the first formation phase, 4.6 billion years ago, ornithosite was supposed to be the type of rock that the surface was made out of. And here they were told by the geologists, please, we think there's going to be some ornithosite around this area. Please go find it. This is your mission. And they walked out, and here it was sitting on this little pedestal waiting for them to pick it up 4.6 billion years later. Okay, now I'm sure it hasn't been sitting there 4.6 billion years, but it formed then, and some event somewhere along the line in the history of the moon jettisoned it up, and it fell and landed on this little pedestal, just waiting for Dave Scott and for James Irwin to come pick it up. Okay, so they brought that little baby home. The other thing about Apollo 15 that might be interesting is, and it's also in Andrew Chaikin's book, is they got in a little bit of trouble by trying to sign some first edition stamps, uncanceled stamps, and sell them to build up a fund for their children's college. And they got caught, and it kind of was a scandal. But nonetheless, I forgive Dave Scott. He's one of my absolute favorite astronauts. Now, what I'd like you to notice here is with the rover, they were able to actually drive several kilometers away to different areas and really study these areas. So this is 1 day's worth of excursion. This is day 2. This is day 3, and this is day 1. So that really changed the game for the amount of exploration that could be done on the moon, having the rover. Okay, Apollo 16. Sometimes I call this the John and Charlie show because it's jokingly called that in Andrew Chaikin's book. And okay, it's a little bit of toilet humor, but When Apollo 15 came home, they found out that the electrolytes were very low in the astronauts because the moonwalks were so demanding on them. So they decided to have the Apollo 16 astronauts drink a lot of orange juice to keep their electrolytes up. And even in their space helmets while they were walking, there was a little tab they could move with their face, and it would release some orange juice. And it turned out that it was a horrible design. And they said by the time they had their first EVA, they got back and their heads were just soaked in orange juice from it being released. And the other thing was that there was so much acidity in the orange juice that they ended up farting a lot. And so when the two astronauts were trying to sleep at night in the lunar landing module, it turned out that it became the John and Charlie show. So I'll stop there with the humor. Okay, who flew? John Young, Charlie Duke. I talked about them in Ken Mattingly. This is Ken Mattingly. He was supposed to fly on Apollo 13, but as I said, they thought he had the measles and he got reassigned to Apollo 16. Here's a very famous picture of John Young jumping while he's saluting the flag. While he was on the moon, it turned out that NASA had received notice from the government that they had approved the funding for the space shuttle, and John Young ended up being the commander of the first space shuttle. Here's an amazing picture of an astronaut looking out over this vastness. They're the only two people on this orb, and I can't imagine what that was like. Now, some of you may say, where are the pictures of the stars? Well, you basically, if you open the camera shutter long enough to let the film be sensitive to the starlight, which is very dim, you would overexpose the ground and the pictures of the astronauts would be completely washed out on the film. And so these are very fast shutter pictures, and so fast that the starlight didn't have enough, there's not enough sensitivity in the film to pick up the trickles of starlight that you would see. So sometimes people argue that they're all faked because they didn't do the stars, but come on. Okay, again, this was in April of 1972, and their job was to see whether there was volcanism on the moon. And so they picked this area called the Descartes Plains, and you can see where they landed. Here's the flag, and EVA 1, and then EVA 2, and then EVA 3 for their 3 days. And they basically were going around and they were trying to determine whether these were actual volcanoes. And it turned out that none of them were. And so what happened was they felt on the moon like they were failing because they were not accomplishing the mission of finding evidence for volcanoes. But in the end, it really taught the geologists that a lot of these features were not volcanic in nature, that in fact they were impact craters. And this really taught the geologists a lot about the history of the geology of the moon. Okay, I think I'll move on, even though I know like 6 or 7 stories that go on with this. I will move on because we're an hour and a half into this lecture. Apollo 17, notable thing was that it launched at night. And in this case, the crew was Gene Cernan, the commander, and you can see the red stripes. He flew on Apollo 10. So he flew with Stafford on Apollo 10. So this was his second trip to the moon. This time he walked on the moon. So 3 astronauts flew to the moon twice. Okay. Then you have Ron Evans. He was the command module pilot. And then you have Jack Schmitt, or also known as Harrison Schmitt, or Dr. Rock, who was responsible for teaching the astronauts how to do geology, and then he got to do geology. Now the thing is that Harrison Schmitt was not prime crew of Apollo 17. And then it turned out that NASA was having a lot of pressure to put a scientist on the moon from the scientific community, given the fact that this was the last mission. So the individual, I can't remember his name, who got kicked off the Apollo 17 mission pretty much toward the last 6 months and didn't get to walk on the moon, and was replaced by Harrison Schmitt. So you can imagine what that person feels like in history. Okay, So they landed in the Taurus littoral highlands, and this was equivalent, they say, to landing into the bottom of the Grand Canyon, 15,000-foot mountains on both sides in this valley with all of these craters. And they again did 3 EVAs, driving the furthest that anybody had done. They did all the records, the longest EVAs, the longest time on the moon, the farthest away from the EVA, collected the most rocks, everything. They are the record holders of all Apollo missions. This rock here is called House Rock. You can see how big it is compared to the rover. And then here's Harrison Schmitt. Here they are down in the plains where the landing area is, showing the rover. And you can imagine how big these mountains are and what this must have felt like to see this in person, this grand expanse in the blackness of space. Okay. Here's a beautiful picture of Cernan and Jack Schmitt in the lunar landing module later. So again, a spectacular full-up mission that was the end of Apollo and made a lot of people very sad. When Gene Cernan left, he calls himself the last man on the moon, which technically is true. He was the first down from the lander onto the moon, but then Jack Schmitt returned to the lander for after the final moonwalk first, and Gene Cernan was the last person who actually made footsteps on the moon. So there's a movie called Last Man on the Moon. There's a book that Gene Cernan wrote called Last Man on the Moon about himself. And these are the words he said, where he presented a challenge for you, for me, for everybody else who followed him. My generation did not live up to this challenge. I hope your generation will. And what he wrote was, or said, is as we leave the moon at Taurus Littoral, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. As I take these last steps from the surface for some time to come, I'd just like to record that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny for tomorrow. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17. So you can see there's a little bit of Cold War Americanism in there, left over from the Cold War. Actually, I wouldn't say left over. The 70s were still in the midst of the Cold War. And the idea of humankind being free and that the astronauts had come for all mankind, and they'd come for all free people, that all was permeated in the Apollo program, particularly in the astronauts' minds. And those are the people. So he laid this foundation for the future in this challenge. Now, this is one of the saddest quotes that I know of. This is Gene Cernan, who said shortly before his death, "I am quite disappointed that I'm still the last man on the moon." And he was a great spirit, great character, really promoted the space program after it had stopped going to the moon. But alas, on January 16 of 2017, he passed away. Now, that brings us to this little chart that I made just for you, because I like you guys that much. This is a list of all the men who went to the moon, some of them that went 2 times, some of them who never walked on the moon, and then those who did walk on the moon. And this is a list in red of those who have now passed away. Most of these astronauts are in their mid-80s and pushing 90. So you can see that it's going to be very rapid here in the next 5 years or so that most of these people may pass away. And I'm giving this lecture in March of 2021. So 24 men flew to the moon, 3 went twice. 9 who have been on the moon are still alive, okay, out of the 12 that walked on it. I'm sorry, 9 who have been on the moon live. I don't know what that means. Who have been to the moon live. Okay, I got it. 9 who have been to the moon are still alive. That includes command module pilots that didn't walk on the moon. 12 walked on it. Of the 12 that walked on it, 4 are still alive. Okay, I forgot what I was doing. Okay. Okay, only 9 living human beings have seen the full globe of the Earth that are alive today, okay, out of the 24. Actually, 21 because 3 went twice. Out of 21 people in the whole world of all time that have seen the globe as a whole, only 9 are still alive that have that memory that walk among us, okay? Only 4 of those, like I said, were people that actually saw it while standing on another body like the moon. Okay, here's the accounting. Apollo 8, 2 are still alive. None of those were walkers. Apollo 10, 1 is still alive, none were walkers, and we go on down the thing. Apollo 11, that's interesting. I believe 2 are still alive, Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin. So I got that wrong, and Buzz Aldrin walked. Apollo 12, they've all passed. Apollo 13, 2 are alive, none of them walked. Apollo 14, they've all died. Apollo 15, 1 of those has survived, and he was a walker. Apollo 16, 2 have survived, 1 was a walker. Apollo 17, 1 has survived, and he was a walker, and that's Harrison Schmitt. So here's the list. Buzz Aldrin, he was the second to walk on the moon. He's still alive from Apollo 11. Armstrong died. Alan Bean from 12 died. Gene Cernan on 10 and 17 died. Mike Collins, still alive, didn't walk. Pete Conrad, commanded Apollo 12, died in a motorcycle accident. Charlie Duke, still alive. Rod Evans, died. Richard Gordon on Apollo 12, died. Fred Hayes, Apollo 13, still alive. James Irwin, died. Jim Lovell went on 8-13, still alive. Ken Mattingly on 16, still alive. Edgar Mitchell, died. Stu LaRussa, died. Dave Scott, still alive. Harrison Schmitt, still alive. Alan Shepard, died. Tom Stafford, alive. Jack Schweikert from 13, died. Alf Warden, 15, died. John Young, died. So as you can see, many of them have died, and very few of them have this living memory. And what we all fear is that before the next person goes into cislunar space and sees the Earth as a whole, or somebody goes into orbit around the moon or walks on the moon, that the living memory of this, of people who have done it, will have perished. And so let's not let that happen. Now, one of the things that you all need to know is that a lot more missions were planned than actually happened, and this was because of budget cuts. This was the original plan, Apollo 11, and then Apollo 12 through 15, and this would be phase 2. And then phase 3 with the science would have been Apollo 16 through 20, okay? Where they were gonna land on these various large craters. Copernicus is a huge, beautiful crater on the moon, and the Tycho crater, another huge, beautiful crater on the moon. But in fact, these got dropped, and the original, the actual missions then became Apollo 11, and then the end of phase 2 here with 12, 13, and 14, and then phase 3 became 15, 16, and 17. In NASA, they called phase 1 the G missions, and phase 2 the H missions, and phase 3 the J missions. I called them phase 1, 2, and 3 just for the sake of the lecture, but really they were the G, H, and J missions. Now, Apollo didn't end with Apollo 12 or 17, actually. One more mission flew, but it didn't go to the moon. So this was not really an Apollo moon mission. But in 1975, the Soviets and the United States got together and had a docking in space. They called this the Apollo Soyuz test project. Notable amongst the crew for the Russians was Alexei Leonov, and also notable amongst the crew for the Apollo was Deke Slayton. Yes, Deke Slayton, the original Mercury astronaut who didn't get to fly in Mercury, didn't get to fly in Gemini, but then finally in 1975, a full 15 years later, being the manager of the astronaut office, he got to fly in space. So now we can really call him astronaut Deke Slayton. And then Tom Stafford, who flew in Gemini and then flew on commanded Apollo 10, was the commander of the Apollo spacecraft. Here's the Proton rocket lifting off the Soyuz spacecraft. And here's the Saturn 1B lifting off the Apollo spacecraft. Here is a beautiful photograph, ladies and gentlemen, of Alexei Leonov and Deke Slayton meeting each other in space, having dinner. And while they're eating their blue toothpaste dinner, Alexei Leonov says into the camera, "It is not what you eat, but with whom you eat that matters." And so they got to eat as best friends. And really, it thawed out the space race. And I like to say that this mission was really the end of the space race. You know, when Stafford and Leonov shook hands in the tunnel here of this docking ring, that really, in a sense, ended the space race. You know, we are now going to be able to work together in space. And last but not least, for all of you who have been brave enough to hold on for this long duration, let's just talk a little bit about what's going to come. This is the Saturn V, a full 365 feet tall. It flew missions from 66 to 72 in the 1900s. After that, the space shuttle, a whole almost 10 years later, it flew. John Young flew the first one in 1981. Now, 7.9 million pounds of thrust was in the Saturn V. The space shuttle only had 470,000, okay? And it was only able to lift payloads up into Earth orbit, in fact, into low Earth orbit, LEO. But it was responsible for helping to build the space station. Now, it had a different design. It had these two solid rocket boosters, and we'll talk about that later because we're going to do a lecture series on the space shuttle's missions. Then the vehicle that NASA is building today is called the SLS, for Space Launch System. Now, it's hoped that it will fly maybe by the end of this year. Now, every year that I give this lecture, maybe by the end of this year, that's been going on for years now, but maybe by the end of this year, the Space Launch System, or the SLS rocket, will fly. This is being touted as NASA's outlet to deep space. It is not as powerful as the Saturn V rocket was. It uses a combination of liquid fuel and solid rocket boosters that the space shuttle used. Okay, so we'll talk about the SLS in upcoming lectures, but I just wanted to share that with you, that this rocket is being built, that there's a new project called Artemis that we'll talk about, and Artemis is the sister goddess of the god Apollo. So you can see that they're moving it more toward a feminine type of project name. And in fact, Artemis's goal is to put a woman on the moon. So the next person that NASA wants to put on the moon is going to be a female. So there you have it, folks. That is my very extended version. I apologize for the length of the Apollo missions. And there will be some supplementary videos that you should watch. And the To the Moon video is a spectacular story. It shows all of the nitty-gritty details of the Apollo 11 landing. It talks about how the astronauts learned geology from Lee Silver, and then what Apollo 15 was like, the Genesis rock, and then all the way through Apollo 17, and ends with Apollo 17 and Gene Cernan talking about those words he said on the moon. Fantastic movie, a must watch, and please read the book of Andrew Chakins. As you know, he's going to come visit the class, and if you read his book, you'll really be able to ask him some great questions. Okay, over and out, signing off. Next time we come back, it will be second part of the Russian-Soviet space program and the transition of that into the Russian space program, followed by the Chinese space program, and then other Asian space programs that are developing rockets, and the Israel, India, the United Arab Emirates, and Taiwan and Japan are making their way into the space world. Then we'll go into Module 3 and talk about new space. Thank you for listening today. We'll see you next time.